The mortar and pestle sang its deadly lullaby in the suffocating darkness of the cellar, each circular grind releasing whispers of destruction that would soon bloom in the bellies of the Whitmore family. Celeste's weathered hands moved with the methodical precision of a woman who had spent 15 years perfecting the art of service. But tonight, those same hands crafted something far more sinister than cornbread and molasses. The broken window, glass, collected piece by treacherous piece from the servants' quarters where Master Edmund had hurled a bottle in his latest drunken rage, transformed under her relentless grinding into powder fine as flour, deadly as nightshade. Each fragment that crumbled beneath the stone pestle carried with it the weight of 1,000 humiliations, 1,000 lashes, 1,000 nights when she had bitten her tongue until it bled, rather than speak the curses that burned in her throat, like acid. The thin shaft of moonlight that slipped through the cellar's single window caught the glass powder, making it shimmer like cursed snow in the bowl. Celeste paused in her grinding, her dark eyes reflecting that same ethereal glow. And for a moment she appeared less like a woman and more like some vengeful spirit conjured from the bowels of hell itself. Above her head, the floorboards creaked, with the settling weight of the plantation house, and she could almost feel the Whitmores sleeping peacefully in their feather beds, their stomachs full of her cooking, their consciences unburdened by the blood on their hands. Yesterday's scene played behind her eyelids like a fever dream she couldn't shake. Young Marcus, barely 14, thin as a rail with eyes too old for his face, had been serving the midday meal when his trembling hands betrayed him. The soup tureen slipped, sending hot liquid cascading across the mahogany table and onto Master Edmund's finest coat. The silence that followed had been deafening, broken only by the slow drip of soup from the table's edge to the Persian rug below. "You worthless piece of—" Edmund's voice had cut through the dining room like a blade, his face purpling with rage. 20 lashes, now. Celeste had watched from the kitchen doorway as they dragged Marcus to the whipping post, had heard his screams echo across the plantation grounds like the cries of some wounded animal. She had seen the way Mrs. Helena delicately dabbed her lips with her napkin and continued eating, commenting on the excellent seasoning of the very soup that now painted Marcus's back with crimson stripes. The twins, Virginia and Cordelia, had giggled behind their fans about some boy from a neighboring plantation, as if the sounds of agony drifting through the open windows were nothing more than birdsong. But it was the moment afterward that had broken something fundamental inside Celeste's chest. When Marcus collapsed, unconscious from pain and blood loss, Master Edmund had turned to her with casual indifference and said, "Clean up this mess, Celeste, and make sure that boy learns his place, or next time it'll be 50 lashes." The grinding resumed, each rotation of the pestle matching the rhythm of her heartbeat. Grind, scrape, grind, scrape. The sound filled the cellar like a death knell, and Celeste found herself humming an old spiritual her grandmother had sung, about deliverance, about justice, about the Lord working in mysterious ways. Tonight the Lord would work through her hands. The glass powder accumulated in the mortar like a small mountain of retribution. She had tested it on rats first, watching with cold satisfaction as they writhed and died, their insides shredded by invisible blades. It would be slower in humans, she reasoned, more subtle. They would think themselves merely ill at first, perhaps blame the Charleston heat or some passing malady. By the time they realized the truth, it would be far too late. Her memories drifted to another time, another injustice. 5 years ago, when her daughter Lily, sweet, beautiful Lily with her bright laugh and quick mind, had been sold to a plantation in Georgia to pay for Master Edmund's gambling debts. Celeste had begged, had offered to work without wages, had prostrated herself at Helena's feet pleading for mercy. But the transaction had already been completed, the money already changing hands, and Lily had been loaded onto a wagon like livestock, reaching through the slats with desperate fingers, as Celeste ran alongside until her legs gave out. "Mama!" Lily's voice had carried on the wind, growing fainter with each mile. "Mama, don't let them take me." But Celeste had been powerless then, just as she had been powerless yesterday when they whipped Marcus, just as she had been powerless through 15 years of service that felt more like slow death. The Whitmores owned her body, her time, her labor, But they had never owned her soul, and now that soul burned with a purpose darker than the cellar's shadows. The powder was ready. Fine as dust, invisible when mixed properly, tasteless as death itself. She spooned it carefully into a small cloth pouch, her movements deliberate and reverent, like a priest preparing communion wine. Except this communion would offer no salvation, only a reckoning 15 years in the making. Through the ceiling she could hear the house beginning to stir. Cook fires would need to be lit, breakfast prepared, the morning routine that had structured her life like prison bars. But today would be different. Today she would serve Master Edmund his eggs just the way he liked them, sunny side up with a dash of salt, a grinding of pepper, and the finest dusting of glass powder Charleston had ever known. Celeste tucked the pouch into her apron pocket and gathered her grinding tools, erasing all evidence of her nocturnal activities. The rats she had tested the powder on lay stiff and cold in the corner, their small bodies a testament to the effectiveness of her creation. She would dispose of them later, along with any remaining traces of her work. As she climbed the cellar stairs, each step bringing her closer to the kitchen, where she would begin her day's deadly service, Celeste felt something she hadn't experienced in years: power. For the first time since being dragged from her mother's cabin as a child and sold into bondage, she held life and death in her weathered hands. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same hands that had nurtured and fed the Whitmore family would now become the instruments of their destruction. The kitchen greeted her with familiar shadows and the lingering scent of yesterday's bread. Soon the hearth would be blazing, the cast iron pans heating, the morning symphony of breakfast preparation filling the air. Mrs. Helena would ring her bell at precisely 7 o'clock, demanding her morning coffee with cream and sugar. Master Edmund would lumber down the stairs at 7:30, already irritable and reaching for his bourbon before the sun fully cleared the horizon. The twins would flutter down like butterflies in their morning dresses, chattering about balls and beaux and the meaningless gossip that filled their empty heads. And Celeste would serve them all, smiling her practiced servant's smile, bobbing, her head in deference, playing the role she had perfected over 15 years of captivity. But beneath that facade, behind her downcast eyes and humble posture, death would be stirring their porridge and seasoning their eggs. The mortar and pestle sat cleaned and innocent on the kitchen shelf, bearing no trace of their midnight purpose. The glass powder nestled against Celeste's hip like a secret lover, waiting for its moment to bloom. Above her head, Charleston's pre-dawn sky began its slow transformation from black to gray, and somewhere in the servants' quarters, Marcus moaned. In his sleep, his wounds a reminder of the price of powerlessness, but tonight the balance of power would begin to shift. Tonight Celeste had ground more than glass. She had ground the seeds of justice, bitter and sharp, ready to take root in the soil of the Whitmore family's sins. The grinding hour was over. The feeding hour was about to begin. The morning bells. Shrill cry cut through the humid Charleston air like a blade through silk, summoning the household to consciousness with the same merciless precision that had governed plantation life for generations. Celeste stood at the kitchen hearth, her back straight as a ramrod, stirring the breakfast porridge with movements that appeared routine, but concealed a tremor of anticipation that ran through her very bones. The glass powder lay hidden in her apron pocket, waiting like a coiled serpent for its moment to strike. Steam rose from the cast iron pots in ghostly spirals, and Celeste found herself mesmerized by the way the vapor dissipated into nothingness. Much like the Whitmore family would, she mused, given enough time and patience. The cornbread cooling on the windowsill looked innocent enough, golden and fragrant with butter and honey, but she knew better. She had been generous with the glass powder in that particular batch, mixing it into the cornmeal with the same care she once reserved for her grandmother's secret spice blends. The sound of footsteps on the grand staircase announced the descent of Master Edmund, his heavy boots creating a rhythm that had haunted Celeste's mornings for 15 years. She could picture him without looking, his florid face already flushed with the promise of bourbon, his waistcoat straining against a belly grown soft from years of excess, his pale eyes scanning the dining room like a hawk searching for prey to torment. Celeste! His voice boomed across the plantation house, carrying that familiar note of irritation that seemed permanently lodged in his throat. "Where's my coffee? And it better be hot this time, or you'll join that clumsy boy Marcus in learning what happens to servants who can't do their jobs properly." "Yes, Master Edmund," she called back, her voice steady as stone despite the fury that blazed behind her ribs. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, pouring the steaming coffee into his favorite china cup, the one painted with delicate roses that would soon be stained with something far more sinister than coffee rings. A tiny pinch of glass powder dissolved into the black liquid, invisible as air, deadly as sin. Mrs. Helena's bell chimed next, a delicate silver sound that demanded attention with the quiet authority of a woman born to privilege. Celeste arranged the breakfast tray with meticulous care. Eggs Benedict for the mistress, prepared exactly as she preferred with the hollandaise sauce she claimed reminded her of her honeymoon in New Orleans. The glass powder folded into the sauce like a whisper of death, undetectable among the rich butter and egg yolks. The twins would be next, Virginia and Cordelia, those porcelain dolls with their perfect ringlets and empty eyes, who had never known a day of hardship in their pampered lives. Their morning chocolate would be prepared with extra cream and a generous helping of Celeste's special ingredient, a gift to celebrate their upcoming debutante ball, though they would never live to see it. As she climbed the servants' stairs to the main floor, carrying the morning feast that would mark the beginning of the end, Celeste felt the weight of history pressing against her shoulders. How many enslaved women had walked these same steps, carrying food to their masters, smiling while their hearts broke, serving while their souls screamed? She was walking in the footsteps of her grandmother, her great-grandmother, generations of women who had swallowed their rage and called it survival. But survival was no longer enough. The dining room gleamed in the morning light filtering through tall windows that overlooked the cotton fields where other souls toiled under the merciless sun. The mahogany table stretched like an altar between them, set with crystal and silver that had been polished by hands that would never own such luxuries. Master Edmund sat at the head of the table like a bloated king, already reaching for his bourbon despite the early hour. "About time," he grunted, not bothering to look at her as she placed his coffee cup within reach. "And where's my cornbread? You know I can't start the day without it." "Right here, Master Edmund," Celeste murmured, setting the basket of golden bread before him like an offering to some terrible god. She watched with barely concealed fascination as his thick fingers tore off a generous piece and stuffed it into his mouth, chewing with the graceless appetite of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. Mrs. Helena swept into the room like a vision in ivory silk, her morning dress pristine despite the oppressive heat that already pressed against the windows. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who had been trained from birth to embody perfection. Her pale hands folded delicately as she took her customary seat at Edmund's right side. "Good morning, my dear," she said to her husband, though her tone suggested the sentiment was merely habit rather than affection. "I trust you slept well despite all that noise from the quarters. Really, Edmund, you must speak to the overseer about maintaining better discipline among the field hands." Edmund grunted his agreement around another mouthful of poisoned cornbread, and Celeste felt a sick thrill of satisfaction watching him swallow his destruction with such obvious pleasure. She placed Mrs. Helena's eggs Benedict before her with a respectful curtsy, noting with professional pride how the hollandaise sauce gleamed like liquid gold in the morning light. "Thank you, Celeste," Mrs. Helena said, lifting her fork with the precise movements of someone who had learned to eat, like a lady before she could properly walk. "The presentation is lovely as always. I don't know what we would do without you." The irony of those words hung in the air like incense, and Celeste had to bite her tongue to keep from laughing. They would find out soon enough what they would do without her. They would die, slowly and painfully, never understanding that their most trusted servant had become their angel of death. Virginia and Cordelia arrived in a flurry of pastel muslin and giggling whispers, their blonde ringlets bouncing as they settled into their chairs with the careless energy of youth. At 16, they were mirror images of their mother's beauty but without the steel beneath the silk that came with age and marriage. They were soft creatures, pampered and protected, utterly unprepared for the harsh realities that would soon visit their sheltered world. "Oh, Mama," Virginia gushed, reaching for her morning chocolate. "Mrs. Beauregard said that the Pemberton boy has been asking about me at every social function this season. Do you think he'll propose before the ball?" "Don't be so forward, sister," Cordelia chided, though her own eyes sparkled with excitement. "A lady never discusses such matters so openly." She took a delicate sip of her chocolate, and Celeste watched with predatory intensity as the girl's throat worked to swallow the deadly brew. Mrs. Helena smiled indulgently at her daughters while cutting into her eggs Benedict with surgical precision. "You girls must remember that patience is a virtue. The right gentleman will declare himself when the time is appropriate." She paused to dab at her lips with her napkin, frowning slightly. "Though I must say, Celeste, there's something different about the hollandaise this morning. A bit of roughness to the texture." Celeste's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird, but her expression remained placid as still water. "I apologize, Mrs. Helena. Perhaps the cream was slightly turned by the heat. I'll be more careful in the future." "See that you do," Edmund rumbled, reaching for another piece of cornbread. "Can't have the ladies suffering from poor cooking. What would our guests think?" He bit into the bread with renewed vigor, apparently finding nothing amiss with its deadly seasoning. The conversation continued around the breakfast table, flowing over topics that seemed absurd in light of what was truly happening. The twins chattered about their ball gowns and dance cards. Mrs. Helena discussed the arrangement of flowers for the church social, and Edmund pontificated about cotton prices and the troublesome nature of their human property. All the while, they consumed their poisoned feast with the same thoughtless appetite they brought to everything else in their privileged lives. Celeste moved through the room like a shadow, refilling coffee cups and clearing plates, maintaining the invisible efficiency that had made her invaluable to the household. But beneath her servant's mask, she was counting every bite, cataloging every swallow, marking the beginning of what she had decided would be their final meal together as a family. As she returned to the kitchen with the morning's dishes, she allowed herself a moment of dark satisfaction. The first phase was complete. The Whitmore family had consumed their first taste of justice, and already she could see the faintest signs that her plan was taking root. Mrs. Helena continued to dab at her mouth, clearly troubled by some irritation she couldn't identify. Master Edmund cleared his throat repeatedly, as if trying to dislodge something that wouldn't quite settle. The twins seemed less animated than usual, their giggles slightly forced. But this was only the beginning. The glass powder would do its work slowly, she knew, building like a storm on the horizon until it finally broke over them with the full force of 15 years' worth of accumulated rage. Today they would experience mild discomfort. Tomorrow, perhaps some stomach troubles they would attribute to the heat or some passing illness. By the end of the week, they would understand that their trusted cook had become their executioner, and by then, it would be far too late to save themselves from the fate they had earned through years of cruelty and indifference. The grinding hour had ended. The feeding hour had begun, and somewhere in the servants' quarters young Marcus still bore the welts of yesterday's whipping, a reminder that justice delayed was not justice denied, only justice refined to its most potent and terrible form. Subscribe and comment below to follow Celeste's dark journey as the Whitmore family begins their slow descent into a hell of her making. 3 days had passed since Celeste began her campaign of silent vengeance, and the Whitmore plantation house had taken on the oppressive atmosphere of a tomb waiting for its occupants. The morning sun filtered through the Spanish moss draped over the ancient oaks, casting shifting shadows across the veranda, where Mrs. Helena sat hunched over her embroidery, her usually perfect posture compromised by the gnawing pain that had taken residence in her stomach like an unwelcome guest. Celeste moved through the kitchen with the measured precision of a woman conducting a deadly orchestra, each meal another movement in her symphony of destruction. The glass powder had become as essential to her cooking as salt or pepper, and she had grown bolder with each passing day, increasing the portions with the calculated patience of someone who understood that revenge, like fine wine, improved with time. Master Edmund's booming voice no longer carried its usual authority. Instead, It had developed a rough, grating quality that suggested something sharp had taken up residence in his throat. He sat at the head of the breakfast table like a wounded bear, pushing food around his plate with uncharacteristic hesitation, his florid complexion having taken on a sickly pallor that made his pale eyes appear even more washed out than usual. "Celeste," he called, his voice cracking like dried leather. "This porridge tastes off. Are you using spoiled milk again?" "No, Master Edmund," she replied with practiced deference, though inwardly she savored his discomfort like a fine delicacy. "I used fresh milk from this morning's milking. Perhaps you're feeling poorly from the heat?" The twins sat at their customary places, but their usual animated chatter had been replaced by listless picking at their food. Virginia's normally bright eyes appeared dull and unfocused, while Cordelia kept pressing her hand to her stomach with small involuntary winces that she tried to hide behind her napkin. Their morning chocolate sat largely untouched, steam rising from the cups like incense at a funeral. "Mama," Virginia whispered, her voice barely audible above the clinking of silverware. "My mouth feels strange, like I've been eating sand." Mrs. Helena looked up from her own untouched breakfast, her embroidery forgotten in her lap. Dark circles had appeared beneath her eyes over the past 3 days, giving her the appearance of someone who had been touched by death and found the experience wanting. "Perhaps we should send for Dr. Pemberton, Edmund. This malaise seems to be affecting the entire family." Edmund grunted his agreement, though the sound came out more like a wheeze. "Probably something going around Charleston. These summer fevers can be the devil to shake." He attempted another spoonful of porridge, then pushed the bowl away with disgust. "Though I've never had a fever that made everything taste like I've been chewing on broken crockery." From her position by the sideboard, Celeste felt a thrill of dark satisfaction course through her veins. The glass powder was doing its work with admirable efficiency, creating tiny lacerations in their mouths and throats that would heal slowly, if at all. Each swallow brought fresh agony, each bite a new reminder that something fundamental had changed in their carefully ordered world. The sound of hoofbeats on the gravel drive announced the arrival of Dr. Pemberton, summoned by a message, sent the previous evening when Mrs. Helena's stomach pains had grown too severe to ignore. Celeste watched through the kitchen window as the elderly physician climbed down from his carriage, his black bag in hand and his weathered face set in lines of professional concern. Dr. Pemberton was a fixture in Charleston society, a man who had delivered half the Plantation family's children and buried the other half when disease or violence claimed them. His presence at the Whitmore house would be noted and discussed in drawing rooms across the county, adding an element of public scrutiny that Celeste found oddly comforting. Let them all whisper about the mysterious illness that had befallen the family. It would only add to the atmosphere of dread that was beginning to permeate the plantation like fog rolling in from the harbor. She busied herself with preparing tea service for the doctor's visit, taking special care to dust the china cups with just enough glass powder to ensure that anyone who partook would carry a little piece of her justice with them. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had become like one of the ancient Greek furies, dispensing retribution with the same methodical care that she had once reserved for nurturing and feeding. Through the thin walls of the plantation house she could hear Dr. Pemberton's measured voice as he questioned each family member about their symptoms. The examination would reveal nothing conclusive, she knew. Glass powder left no obvious traces, created no distinctive patterns that would point to deliberate poisoning. The doctor would likely attribute their collective malaise to some seasonal ailment or contaminated water, never suspecting that their most trusted servant had become their angel of death. Samuel, the butler who had served the Whitmore family almost as long as Celeste herself, appeared in the kitchen doorway with his usual silent efficiency. His dark face bore the impassive expression that all plantation slaves had learned to wear like armor. But Celeste caught something different in his eyes, a sharpness that hadn't been there before, a calculating awareness that made her suddenly conscious of her own vulnerability. "Doctor wants tea brought to the parlor," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying none of its usual deference. "Says the family needs something to settle their stomachs." Celeste nodded, arranging the delicate china cups on the silver tray with movements that appeared routine, but concealed the tremor of anticipation that ran through her fingers. "Of course, I've prepared chamomile. It should help with their digestive troubles. Samuel's eyes fixed on hers for a moment longer than propriety dictated, and she felt the weight of his scrutiny like a physical thing. Did he suspect? Had her nighttime activities in the cellar been observed? The thought sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Funny thing, Samuel said casually, picking up the tray with hands that had polished silver and served meals. For 30 years. Been hearing strange noises from the cellar these past few nights. Grinding sounds like someone preparing grain for flour. But we got all the grain we need already milled and stored. Celeste's blood turned to ice in her veins, but she managed to keep her expression neutral. Perhaps rats have gotten into the supplies. I'll check later and set some traps if needed. Rats, Samuel repeated thoughtfully, as if testing the word on his tongue. Yes, I suppose that could be it. Though these rats seem mighty industrious, working so late into the night. He paused at the doorway, the tea service balanced perfectly on his arms. Of course, rats can be dangerous creatures when they're cornered. Never know what they might do to survive. The warning in his words was subtle but unmistakable, and Celeste felt the first stirring of real fear since she had begun her campaign. Samuel had always been observant. It was what had kept him alive and relatively safe in a world where awareness meant the difference between a comfortable position and a brutal death in the fields. If he suspected what she was doing, how long before he acted on that suspicion? But as she watched him disappear toward the parlor, carrying his tray of poisoned tea to the suffering family, she realized that his knowledge might not necessarily be a threat. Samuel had endured his own share of humiliations and brutalities at the hands of the Whitmores. Perhaps like her, he had simply been waiting for the right moment to strike back. The afternoon wore on with agonizing slowness, punctuated by the sounds of Dr. Pemberton's examination and the increasingly distressed voices of the family as their symptoms worsened. Through the walls, Celeste could hear Master Edmund's harsh coughing fits and Mrs. Helena's soft moans of discomfort. The twins had grown silent, their usual chatter replaced by the occasional whimper or request for more water to soothe their tortured throats. Ruby, the young housemaid who cleaned the family's chambers and tended to their personal needs, slipped into the kitchen like a ghost, her usually bright eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Miss Celeste," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder as if expecting to be overheard. "Something ain't right in this house. The family, they all sick with the same thing, and it ain't no natural illness I ever seen. Master Edmund, he been coughing up blood spots on his pillow, and Miss Helena, she can't keep nothing down but water." Celeste continued kneading bread, dough with steady rhythmic movements, her face a mask of concerned sympathy. "These summer fevers can be fierce, child. I'm sure Dr. Pemberton will know what to do." "It ain't no fever," Ruby insisted, her voice dropping even lower. "Old Sarah, in the quarters, she says the spirits got their claws in this house, says she can smell death in the air, like flowers left too long in a vase." She paused, wrapping her arms around herself as if warding off some invisible chill. "Miss Celeste, you been cooking for this family longer than anyone. You ain't noticed nothing strange about the food? Nothing that might be making them sick?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre, and Celeste felt the weight of 15 years' worth of carefully constructed lies and servile performances pressing down on her shoulders. Ruby was young and innocent, untouched by the kind of rage that had driven Celeste to her terrible purpose. She deserved some measure of truth, even if that truth was wrapped in protective ambiguity. "Sometimes," Celeste said carefully, her hands never pausing in their work, "the Lord works in ways we don't understand. Sometimes, what looks like sickness is really just justice taking its course." Ruby's eyes widened at the implications hidden in those words, and for a moment the kitchen fell silent except for the sound of dough being worked and the distant murmur of voices from the parlor. When Ruby finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a breath. "Justice for what, Miss Celeste? For 15 years of watching children sold away from their mothers, for whipping posts and branding irons and human beings treated like livestock." Celeste's voice remained steady, but there was something in her eyes that made Ruby take an involuntary step backward. "For every tear shed in these quarters, every scream that echoed across these fields, every grave dug for someone who died, Before their time because they were worth less than the cotton they picked. The truth settled between them like a living thing, terrible and beautiful in its naked honesty. Ruby stared at the woman she had known and respected for years, seeing her perhaps for the first time not as the loyal family cook, but as something far more dangerous and magnificent, a force of retribution that had been hiding in plain sight, biding its time until the moment was ripe for harvest. "What happens now?" Ruby whispered, her young face pale with the weight of shared knowledge. Celeste smiled then, and it was neither kind nor cruel, but something beyond both, the smile of someone who had made peace with becoming a monster in service of a cause greater than her own survival. "Now we wait, child, and we watch justice take its course one spoonful at a time." Outside, the afternoon sun beat down on the cotton fields where other enslaved souls continued their backbreaking labor, unaware that in the big house their tormentors were slowly dying from the inside out. And in the kitchen, Celeste returned to her bread-making, humming an old spiritual about deliverance while the glass powder waited patiently in her apron pocket for the evening meal. Don't miss the chilling progression. Subscribe and comment for more horror as the Whitmore family's mysterious illness deepens. The Charleston heat had grown oppressive by the week's end, pressing against the plantation house like a fever dream that refused to break. Mrs. Helena sat in the parlor's damask armchair, her embroidery abandoned in her lap as she held a delicate china teacup with trembling fingers. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows caught something glinting in the amber liquid, a tiny, crystalline fragment that winked like a malevolent star against the tea's surface. Her breath caught in her throat, a sharp intake that had nothing to do with the pain that now lived permanently in her chest. With infinite care, she set the cup down on its saucer, the soft chink of china against china seeming loud as gunshot in the suffocating silence of the room. There, nestled against the delicate rose pattern like a diamond of death, lay a shard of glass no larger than a grain of rice. "Edmund," she called, her voice carrying a tremor that spoke of dawning horror rather than physical weakness. "Edmund, come here." Quickly, Master Edmund appeared in the doorway like a specter of his former self, his once imposing frame diminished by days of internal torment. His face had taken on the waxy pallor of a man dancing with death, and when he spoke, his voice carried the rough rasp of someone whose throat had been scraped raw from the inside. "What is it, Helena? I was trying to review the account books, but the numbers keep swimming before my eyes like—" He stopped mid-sentence as his gaze fell upon the teacup, and the color drained from his face entirely. "Dear God in heaven, what is that?" "Glass," Helena whispered, the word falling from her lips like a curse. "There's glass in my tea." Her eyes, now bright with something between terror and understanding, fixed upon her husband's face. "Edmund, how long have we been feeling poorly? How long have we all been experiencing these difficulties?" Edmund's hands shook as he reached for the teacup, holding it up to the light as if it were evidence in some cosmic trial. The fragment caught the sun's rays and threw them back in fractured rainbows, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. "Since Monday morning. We've all been sick since Monday morning, right after." His voice trailed off as the implications began to settle in his mind like sediment in still water. "Right after breakfast," Helena finished for him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Right after Celeste served us breakfast." The name hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre, carrying with it the weight of 15 years of unquestioned trust and the terrible possibility of betrayal beyond imagination. In the kitchen, just beyond the thin walls that separated the family quarters from the servants' domain, they could hear the familiar sounds of meal preparation, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables, the sizzle of meat in cast iron, the soft humming of spirituals that had once seemed comforting but now carried undertones of something darker. "We must question her," Edmund said, though his voice lacked its usual authority. The glass fragment had stolen more than just his health. It had shattered his fundamental belief in the natural order that had governed his world for 43 years. But carefully. If she's been... He couldn't bring himself to voice the accusation, as if speaking it aloud would make the nightmare real. Helena rose from her chair with the careful movements of someone whose body had become a foreign country, one where pain lived in every province. 15 years, Edmund. She's cooked every meal we've eaten for 15 years. If she wanted to harm us, she could have done so at any time. Why now? What changed? But even as she spoke the words, Helena knew the answer. It lay in the screams that had echoed across the plantation grounds just days ago, in the sight of young Marcus's bloody back, in the casual cruelty that had become so routine they barely noticed it anymore. Marcus, the boy Celeste had raised alongside her own daughter before that child was sold away to pay Edmund's gambling debts. We need to be certain before we act, Helena continued, her mind working with the sharp clarity that often came to the desperate. If we're wrong, we destroy an innocent woman. If we're right. She let the sentence hang unfinished, but both of them could complete it in their minds. If they were right, their most trusted servant had been slowly murdering them for days, and they might already be beyond salvation. In the kitchen, Celeste felt the shift in the house's atmosphere like a change in barometric pressure before a storm. The walls seemed thinner somehow, as if the very structure of the plantation was holding its breath. She had seen Mrs. Helena examining her teacup with unusual intensity, had caught the whispered conversation that followed. The moment she had both anticipated and dreaded had finally arrived. Discovery was no longer a distant possibility, but an imminent reality. Yet she felt no panic, only a strange sense of liberation. The weight of secrecy had grown heavier with each passing day, and there was something almost relieving about the prospect of laying down that burden. She continued her work with steady hands, preparing the evening meal that might well be her last in this kitchen. If they confronted her tonight, at least she would meet her fate with dignity intact and justice partially served. The twins had taken to their beds earlier in the afternoon, their young bodies finally succumbing to the accumulated damage of days of internal torment. Virginia lay pale as porcelain against her silk pillows, her breathing shallow and labored, while Cordelia drifted in and out of fevered dreams that left her calling out for her mother in voices that sounded increasingly childlike and lost. Samuel appeared in the kitchen doorway with his usual silent efficiency, but Celeste caught the meaningful look he cast in her direction. His earlier suspicions had crystallized into certainty, she realized, and now they shared the terrible intimacy of those who knew that everything was about to change forever. "They want to see you in the parlor," he said quietly, his words carrying the weight of a funeral announcement. "Both of them, and they want you to bring the tea service." Celeste nodded, her movements calm as still water despite the earthquake happening beneath her ribs. She arranged the china tea set on its silver tray with the same meticulous care she had always employed, adding a generous helping of glass powder to the sugar bowl for good measure. If this was to be her final performance as the loyal family cook, she would make it memorable. "Samuel," she said softly as she prepared to leave the kitchen that had been both prison and sanctuary for 15 years. "Whatever happens tonight, remember that some sins are too great for forgiveness, and some justice comes too late to matter to the living." His eyes met hers in a moment of perfect understanding, and she saw in them the reflection of her own long-suppressed rage. "I'll remember, Miss Celeste, we all will." The parlor felt like a courtroom when she entered, the afternoon light slanting through the windows in bars of gold that seemed to divide the room into zones of judgment. Master Edmund stood beside the fireplace like a prosecuting attorney, his weakened frame attempting to project an authority he no longer possessed. Mrs. Helena remained seated, but her posture was rigid with tension, and her eyes held the sharp focus of a woman who had finally seen through 15 years of carefully maintained illusions. "Celeste," Edmund began, his damaged voice struggling to carry its usual command, "we need to ask you about something we found in Mrs. Helena's tea this afternoon." "Yes, Master Edmund," Celeste replied, her tone carrying just the right note of concerned puzzlement. She set the tea service down on the mahogany table with hands that didn't tremble, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a bird desperate to escape its cage. Helena lifted the offending teacup, holding it where the light would catch, the glass fragment still nestled against its delicate rim. Can you explain how this came to be in my tea? Celeste studied the cup with the same careful attention she might give to a recipe she was trying to perfect. I'm not sure, Mrs. Helena. Perhaps a piece of crystal fell from the chandelier, or maybe one of the tea glasses broke without anyone noticing. She paused, allowing just the right amount of worry to creep into her voice. Have you been injured? By it? Should I fetch Dr. Pemberton? The response was perfect in its studied innocence, but something in Celeste's eyes betrayed her. Helena caught it. A flash of something that might have been satisfaction, or triumph, or the cold calculation of someone who had been playing a longer game than anyone suspected. 15 years, Helena said softly, her words carrying the weight of accumulated understanding. You've served this family faithfully for 15 years, cooked every meal, tended to our needs, been as loyal as family. The last word came out like a physical blow, and Celeste felt her carefully constructed mask slip for just an instant. Family. The word carried bitter irony from a woman whose husband had sold Celeste's actual family member like livestock to pay for his vices. Yes, ma'am, Celeste replied, but her voice had lost some of its submissive tone. I've served this family just as faithfully as it has served me. The emphasis on the final words was so subtle that a less perceptive listener might have missed it entirely. But Helena had spent a lifetime reading the nuances of social interaction. She understood that Celeste had just declared war with nothing more than the careful placement of stress on a pronoun. Edmund, Helena said without taking her eyes off Celeste's face, I think we need to search the kitchen. And the cellar. I think we need to search very thoroughly. The challenge was laid bare now, hanging in the air between them like the scent of magnolias before a thunderstorm. Master Edmund straightened as much as his weakened frame would allow, reaching for the authority that had once made grown men tremble and slaves scatter like leaves before wind. But when he looked at Celeste, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in 15 years, he saw not the invisible servant who had faded into the background of his life like wallpaper, but a woman whose eyes held depths of knowledge and purpose that suddenly terrified him more than any overseer's whip or plantation owner's rage ever could. Get Samuel, he commanded, though his voice cracked like drought-parched earth. And Ruby, we're going to get to the bottom of this tonight. Celeste smiled then, and it was neither the submissive expression they had grown accustomed to, nor the mask of professional courtesy she had worn for so many years. It was the smile of someone who had been holding back an ocean of truth and had finally decided to let the floodwaters loose. Yes, Master Edmund, she said, her voice carrying a note of anticipation that made both Edmund and Helena's blood run cold. I think it's time we got to the bottom of everything. As she turned to leave the parlor, ostensibly to fetch the other servants, Celeste felt the weight of 15 years lifting from her shoulders like chains falling away. The endgame had begun, and win or lose, she would no longer have to pretend that serving poison was the same thing as serving justice. Behind her, she could hear Edmund and Helena whispering urgently to each other, their voices carrying the desperate tone of people who had finally realized that the monster they feared had been living in their house all along, cooking their meals and knowing their secrets and waiting with infinite patience for the perfect moment to strike. The tension builds to a breaking point. Subscribe and comment to see how this terrifying confrontation unfolds. The cellar had never felt more like a tomb than it did in the flickering candlelight that Samuel carried as he descended the narrow wooden steps, followed by Master Edmund's labored breathing and the rustle of Mrs. Helena's silk dress against the rough stone walls. Celeste brought up the rear, her face a mask of serene composure that belied the thunderstorm raging in her chest. Each step downward felt like a descent into the final circle of some terrible divine comedy, where all masks would be stripped away and truth would stand naked in the shadows. The air grew thick and oppressive as they reached the cellar floor, heavy with the scent of root vegetables and preserved meats. But underneath those familiar smells lurked something else, something that made Helena's nostrils flare with instinctive recognition. It was the metallic tang of powdered glass mixed with the earthy smell of mortality, as if death itself had taken up residence among the pickle barrels and grain sacks. Samuel raised his candle higher, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with malevolent life across the stone walls. The light fell upon the workbench where Celeste had spent so many midnight hours grinding her terrible justice into powder fine as flour, and there, gleaming like evidence of some unholy communion, sat the mortar and pestle that had become the instruments of the Whitmore family's destruction. Master Edmund's sharp intake of breath echoed through the cellar like the death rattle of his old certainties. His pale eyes, now shot through with burst blood vessels from days of internal hemorrhaging, fixed upon the stone bowl with the horrified fascination of a man watching his own grave being dug. "Sweet, merciful Jesus," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own labored breathing. "Helena, look at this. Look what she's done." But Helena was already looking, her gaze moving methodically from the mortar and pestle to the small pile of glass shards scattered across the workbench like deadly confetti, her mind, sharpened by days of pain and the terrible clarity that comes to the dying, began piecing together the evidence with the precision of a coroner examining a corpse. "How long?" she asked quietly, not turning to look at Celeste, but addressing her question to the shadows that seemed to press against them from all sides. "How long have you been planning this?" Celeste stepped forward into the circle of candlelight, and for the first time in 15 years she allowed her true self to show in her eyes. Not the submissive servant or the invisible shadow who had moved through their lives like a ghost, but the woman who had been slowly dying inside for decades until rage had finally given her a reason to live. "Since the day you sold my daughter," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated years like sediment in a deep river. "Since the moment I watched Lily disappear down that road, reaching for me through the wagon slats while you counted your husband's gambling money." The words fell into the cellar like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples of understanding through the suffocating air. Helena's face went white as bone china, and Edmund made a sound deep in his throat that might have been protest or recognition, or simply the final exhalation of a man whose world had just collapsed around him. "That was 5 years ago," Helena whispered, and her voice carried a note of dawning horror as she realized the implications. "You've been planning this for 5 years?" "Planning, waiting, watching," Celeste replied, moving closer to the workbench where her tools of destruction lay scattered like the remnants of some dark ritual. "Learning exactly how much each of you could suffer before the suffering became obvious to others, calculating the perfect balance between justice and invisibility." Samuel, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, stepped forward with the careful movements of someone walking through a minefield. His dark eyes moved between Celeste and the glass shards, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of understanding that made all of them turn to look at him. "I knew," he said quietly, his words falling into the cellar like confessions spoken in church. Not at first, but after the second day, when Master Edmund started coughing up blood and Miss Helena couldn't keep her food down. "I knew someone in this house was dying by degrees, and I knew it wasn't natural." Edmund's face contorted with rage that his weakened body could barely sustain. "You knew? You knew she was poisoning us and you said nothing? You let it continue?" "I let justice continue," Samuel corrected, his voice carrying a steel that none of them had ever heard before. "Same justice that was long overdue for a family that treats human beings like livestock, to be bought and sold at will." The revelation hit Edmund like a physical blow, and he staggered backward against the cellar wall, his hands clutching at the rough stone, as if it were the only solid thing left in a world gone mad. You're both conspirators. Both of you, my own servants plotting against me in my own house." "Your servants," Celeste repeated, and her voice carried a bitter laugh that echoed off the cellar walls like the sound of breaking glass. "Yes, that's what we are. What we've always been. Your property bought and paid for, expected to serve with gratitude for the privilege of being owned by such fine Christian people." She picked up the mortar and pestle, holding them in her weathered hands like sacred objects. "Do you know what it feels like to watch your child being loaded onto a wagon like a sack of grain? To know that she's crying for you, reaching for you, and there's nothing you can do because you're not a person. You're property, and property doesn't get to keep its children when the master needs money for his vices." Helena's breath came in, Short, sharp gasps that had nothing to do with her physical condition, and everything to do with the weight of accumulated guilt, finally settling on her shoulders like a shroud. Celeste, please, we never meant... Never meant what? Celeste's voice cut through Helena's words like a blade through silk. Never meant to destroy families? Never meant to treat human beings like commodities? Never meant to build your comfort on the backs of people who had no choice but to serve you? The candlelight flickered, sending shadows dancing across Celeste's face and making her appear less like a woman and more like some ancient goddess of vengeance risen from the depths of the earth to claim what was owed. You meant every bit of it, Mrs. Helena. Every whipping, every sale, every casual cruelty. You meant it because it was convenient for you, because it maintained the order that kept you comfortable and powerful. Edmund pushed himself away from the wall, summoning what little strength remained in his poisoned body. Even if what you say is true, this isn't justice. This is murder. Cold-blooded murder. Murder. Celeste's laugh was like the sound of wind through a graveyard. How many murders have you committed, Master Edmund? How many people have died in your fields, worked to death for your profit? How many families have you destroyed with your sales? And your whippings and your casual indifference to human suffering? She set the mortar and pestle back on the workbench with deliberate care, her movements precise and final. The only difference between your murders and mine is that mine are honest. I'm not pretending this is for your own good, or that it's God's will, or that it's the natural order of things. I'm killing you because you deserve to die, and I'm doing it slowly because you've earned every moment of suffering. Samuel moved closer to Celeste, his stance making it clear that whatever happened next, she wouldn't face it alone. Master Edmund, you want to talk about justice? Let's talk about Marcus lying in the quarters right now with his back torn open for the crime of spilling soup. Let's talk about the children sold away from their mothers to pay your gambling debts. Let's talk about 15 years of Celeste cooking your meals and cleaning your house and raising your children, while you treated her like she was less than human. This is insurrection, Edmund gasped, his face purpling with rage and effort. This is rebellion against the natural order. You'll both hang for this. Maybe we will, Celeste agreed calmly. But you won't live to see it. None of you will. The glass powder has been doing its work for days now, eating away at your insides like acid. By my calculations, you have perhaps a week left, maybe 2 if you're stronger than you appear. Helena, swayed on her feet, whether from physical weakness or the crushing weight of realization, it was impossible to tell. The children, she whispered. Virginia and Cordelia. Their innocence in this. They never... Your daughters have lived 16 years in comfort built on the suffering of others, Celeste interrupted. They've giggled and flirted and planned their balls while children their own age worked themselves to death in these fields. They may not have wielded the whip themselves, but they've enjoyed every benefit of its use. They're children, Helena's voice cracked like breaking porcelain. So was Lily when you sold her. So was Marcus when you had him whipped. So were all the other children whose lives you've destroyed without a second thought. Celeste's voice softened slightly, but her eyes remained hard as flint. I take no pleasure in their suffering, Mrs. Helena. But justice doesn't recognize innocence built on others' pain. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Edmund's labored breathing and the soft hiss of the candle flame consuming its wick. In that oppressive quiet, all of them could hear the terrible truth settling into the cellar's corners like dust. The Whitmore family was dying, had been dying for days, and there was nothing any of them could do to stop it. What happens now? Helena asked finally, her voice barely more than a whisper. Celeste looked at her for a long moment, seeing perhaps for the first time not the imperious mistress who had governed her life for 15 years, but a woman facing her own mortality, with whatever dignity remained to her. Now you go upstairs and tend to your daughters, Celeste said quietly. You make what peace you can with your God and your conscience. You live what's left of your lives with the knowledge that justice has finally found you. And you? Edmund demanded, though his voice had lost all its authority and carried only the desperate confusion of a man whose world had crumbled around him. I continue to serve, Celeste replied with something that might have been a smile. I cook your meals and tend your house and watch justice take its course one spoonful at a time, just as I have been doing for the past week. As they climbed the stairs back to the main house, leaving behind the evidence of Celeste's terrible work, the weight of revelation settled over them like a burial shroud. The game was over, all cards laid on the table, all masks finally stripped away. What remained was simply the slow march toward an ending that had been written in glass powder and served with each meal. Behind them, in the darkness of the cellar, the mortar and pestle sat silent on the workbench, waiting patiently for their next use in the final chapters of the Whitmore family's story. The Charleston dawn broke like a wound across the sky, painting the Whitmore plantation in shades of blood and gold that seemed almost prophetic in their terrible beauty. Celeste stood at the kitchen window, watching the sun rise over fields that would soon know new masters, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that she had prepared without her special ingredient, a luxury she could finally afford, now that her work was nearly complete. 6 days had passed since the confrontation in the cellar, and the plantation house had transformed into something resembling a tomb where the occupants still drew breath. The twins lay in their beds like broken dolls, their once bright eyes now dull with pain and the growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted in their world. Virginia had stopped asking for water to soothe her throat. Cordelia no longer attempted to sit up when the morning light filtered through her lace curtains. Master Edmund had taken to his study, where he sat hunched over account books he could no longer read, his vision clouded by internal bleeding that painted everything in shades of red. His once booming voice had been reduced to harsh whispers, and when he attempted to call for his bourbon, the sound that emerged was more animal than human. But it was Mrs. Helena who had surprised Celeste the most in these final days. Rather than raging against her fate or pleading for mercy that would never come, she had grown quiet and contemplative, as if the approach of death had finally given her permission to examine the life she had lived with clear eyes. On the third morning, after the revelation, Helena had appeared in the kitchen doorway like a specter in white silk, her face gaunt but her posture still carrying echoes of the dignity that had defined her for 40 years. She had stood there for a long moment, watching Celeste work, before finally speaking words that hung in the air like incense at a funeral. I've been thinking about your daughter, she had said quietly, her voice carrying none of its former authority. Lily. I remember her. She had your eyes, and she used to sing while she worked in the garden. Celeste's hands had stilled on the bread she was kneading, but she hadn't turned around. Yes, ma'am, she had a beautiful voice. I told myself it was necessary, Helena continued, her words coming slowly as if each one cost her something precious. The sale. I told myself it was just business, that it was the way things had to be. But she was just a child, wasn't she? Just a child who wanted to stay with her mother. 15 years old, Celeste had replied, her voice steady as stone. The same age as your daughters are now. Helena had made a sound that might have been a sob, or simply the exhalation of a woman finally allowing herself to feel the weight of her sins. I'm sorry, she had whispered. I know it means nothing now, but I'm sorry. Celeste had turned then, studying the woman who had been both her mistress and her tormentor for so many years. In Helena's eyes, she had seen something she hadn't expected, not just fear or regret, but a kind of terrible understanding. It doesn't change anything, Mrs. Helena, but I'm glad you finally see it. That had been 3 days ago, and Helena hadn't returned to the kitchen since. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, Celeste would catch glimpses of her standing at the parlor window, looking out over the fields with an expression that suggested she was finally seeing them for what they truly were, not symbols of prosperity and genteel living, but monuments to human suffering built on the backs of the enslaved. Dr. Pemberton had stopped coming to the house. His final visit had been marked by frustrated confusion and professional defeat, as he struggled to diagnose an illness that seemed to defy every remedy in his considerable arsenal. The family's symptoms continued to worsen despite his treatments, and the good doctor had finally thrown up his hands and declared it some sort of consumption, that would simply have to run its course. "I've seen nothing like it," he had confided to Edmund during his final visit, unaware that Celeste stood just outside the study door, listening with predatory satisfaction. "It's as if something is eating them from the inside out, but there's no fever, no infection that I can identify. Just deterioration." If only he knew, Celeste had thought, how accurate his assessment truly was. Samuel had proven himself a valuable ally in these final days, helping to maintain the fiction that the family was simply suffering from some mysterious ailment, while quietly assisting Celeste in her work. Together, they had watched the slow dissolution of the household structure that had governed the plantation for decades, observing with clinical detachment as power shifted away from the big house and toward the quarters where whispered conversations spoke of change and freedom and the terrible justice that had finally come to call. Ruby had taken to avoiding the main house entirely, spending her days in the quarters with the other enslaved people, all of whom seemed to sense that something momentous was occurring even if they didn't understand the details. Old Sarah, the ancient woman who claimed to speak with spirits, had been seen burning sage and muttering prayers for the dead, though no one had yet officially died. The evening of the 6th day brought with it an oppressive stillness that seemed to press against the plantation like the weight of accumulated sins. Celeste prepared what she knew would be the final family dinner, taking special care with the presentation even though she doubted any of them would be able to manage more than a few bites. The dining room, when she entered to lay the table, felt like a cathedral dedicated to some dark god of retribution. The mahogany table gleamed in the candlelight, set with the finest china and silver, as if this were some grotesque parody of the Last Supper. Master Edmund sat slumped in his chair at the head of the table, his breathing shallow and labored, while Helena occupied her customary place with the rigid posture of someone who refused to show weakness, even in the face of death. The twins were absent from the meal entirely, too weak now to leave their beds. Through the ceiling, Celeste could hear the occasional soft moan or whispered plea for water, sounds that might have moved her to pity under different circumstances. But pity was a luxury she could no longer afford. Justice had no room for sentiment. "Celeste," Helena said quietly as the cook placed a bowl of soup before her, "I want you to know that I understand why you've done this. I don't forgive it and I can't say you're right, but I understand it." Edmund's head lifted with considerable effort, his pale eyes struggling to focus on his wife's face. "Helena, what are you saying? Don't tell me you're sympathizing with this. This murderer." "She's not a murderer, Edmund," Helena replied, her voice carrying a weight of understanding that seemed to surprise even her. "She's a mother who lost her child. She's a woman who served faithfully for 15 years and watched us treat her like property. She's—" Helena paused, searching for words that could encompass the terrible complexity of their situation. "She's what we made her." The truth of those words settled over the dining room like dust motes in candlelight, and for a moment the only sound was Edmund's ragged breathing and the soft tick of the grandfather clock that had counted the hours of their lives for so many years. Celeste stood beside the sideboard, her hands folded before her, watching the final act of a drama that had been 15 years in the making. In Helena's words, she heard something she hadn't expected. Not absolution, for that was impossible, but recognition. After all these years, someone in the Whitmore family finally saw her as more than just a pair of hands that cooked their meals and cleaned their house. "What happens to us now?" Edmund asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. "You die," Celeste replied simply, without cruelty or satisfaction, just stating a fact as inevitable as sunrise. "Tonight, tomorrow, perhaps the day after. The glass has done its work too well to be stopped now." "And after?" Helena's question came softly, as if she were asking about the weather rather than the disposition of her mortal remains. "Samuel and I will tell the authorities that you succumbed to some wasting disease that Dr. Pemberton couldn't identify. The plantation will be sold to pay your debts, and those of us who survive will likely be separated and sold to new masters." Celeste's voice carried no emotion as she spoke of their shared future. "Unless, of course, the war everyone's whispering about finally comes to pass. then perhaps things will change in ways none of us can imagine. Edmund made a sound that might have been laughter if it hadn't been so hollow. War. Yes, I suppose that's fitting. The world ending just as we do. The meal continued in relative silence, with Helena managing a few spoonfuls of soup and Edmund barely touching his food. Through the walls of the dining room, they could hear the distant sound of singing from the slave quarters, old spirituals about deliverance and crossing over Jordan, songs that carried new meaning in the context of the changes sweeping over the plantation like floodwaters. As the evening wore on, Helena's strength finally gave out, and Samuel helped her to her room with the gentle assistance of someone tending to the genuinely infirm, rather than the master he had served for decades. Edmund lingered at the table, staring at his untouched plate with the fixed attention of a man trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "I don't understand," he said finally, his words directed more to the shadows than to Celeste. "I gave you a home, work, purpose. I treated you better than most masters treat their property." Celeste looked at him for a long moment, this man who had owned her body and her time but had never understood her soul. "You gave me slavery and called it kindness," she said quietly. "You stole my daughter and called it necessity. You whipped children and called it discipline. And through it all, you never once saw us as human beings deserving of the same considerations you demanded for yourself." Edmund's pale eyes struggled to focus on her face, and for a moment she saw in them the confused bewilderment of someone whose fundamental beliefs had been shattered beyond repair. "But the order of things, the way things have always been, was built on lies," Celeste finished for him. "Beautiful, comfortable lies that let you sleep peacefully in your feather beds while people died in the fields to maintain your comfort." She moved closer to his chair, her weathered hands resting on the back of it like a benediction or a curse. "The order is ending, Master Edmund. Can you feel it? The change coming like storm clouds on the horizon. Your world is dying with you, and what comes after will be something you can't even imagine." Edmund's head fell forward onto his chest, and for a moment Celeste thought he might have died right there at his own dining table. But then she heard the soft rasp of his breathing and knew that death was still hours away, close enough to taste, but not yet ready to claim its prize. She left him there, slumped in his chair like a broken king, and climbed the stairs to check on the twins one final time. Virginia lay still as marble against her silk pillows, her breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. Cordelia stirred slightly when Celeste entered her room, her eyes opening to reveal pupils dilated with pain and approaching death. "Celeste?" the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm scared." For the first time since beginning her terrible work, Celeste felt something crack in the armor of righteous anger that had sustained her through the long nights of grinding glass and the longer days of watching her victims slowly die. Cordelia was 16, the same age Lily had been when she was sold away to a fate unknown. "I know, child," Celeste said softly, pulling a chair close to the bed and sitting down with the weariness of someone who had carried too much weight for too many years. "Death is frightening when you're young and haven't lived enough life to make peace with it. Did we?" Cordelia's words came in broken whispers between labored breaths. "Did we do something terrible? Is this punishment?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither of them could fully escape. Celeste looked at this dying girl, pampered and privileged, but still just a child facing the end of everything she had ever known, and felt the terrible weight of moral complexity settling on her shoulders like a shroud. "Yes," she said finally, because lies served no purpose in the face of approaching death. "Your family did terrible things, and yes, this is punishment. But you—" She paused, struggling with words that felt like broken glass in her throat. "You were born into it, raised in it, never given the chance to choose something different." Cordelia's eyes filled with tears that she was too weak to shed. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for whatever we did. I'm sorry." Celeste reached out and took the girl's cold hand in her own weathered ones, offering what comfort she could to someone whose death she had orchestrated. "I know you are, child, and for what it's worth, I'm sorry, too. She stayed with Cordelia until the girl's breathing stopped entirely, sometime in the small hours before dawn. Virginia followed an hour later, slipping away so quietly that Celeste almost missed the moment of her passing. By the time the sun began to paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, both twins lay still and peaceful in their beds, looking more like sleeping angels than the victims of a carefully planned murder. Helena was next, her passing marked by the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout her final days. She died in her sleep, her face serene and unburdened for perhaps the first time in decades. Samuel found her that way when he brought her morning coffee, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the woman who had been both his owner and his charge for 30 years. Master Edmund proved more tenacious, clinging to life with the stubborn persistence of someone who had never been denied anything he truly wanted. He lasted until the afternoon of the 7th day, finally succumbing in his study while staring at account books he could no longer read. His death came not with dignity or peace, but with the frustrated rage of a man who had never understood why the world had suddenly stopped obeying his commands. As the sun set on that final day, Celeste stood on the veranda of the plantation house, looking out over fields that would soon know different hands and different purposes. The weight of 15 years had lifted from her shoulders, but in its place had settled something else, not relief exactly, but a kind of hollow completion that felt almost like death itself. Samuel approached from the direction of the quarters, his face bearing the solemn expression of someone who had just finished digging graves. "It's done," he said simply. "All of them laid to rest in the family plot, with whatever dignity we could manage. And Dr. Pemberton accepted our story about the wasting disease, said he'd seen similar cases during the yellow fever outbreak of '53. Samuel paused, studying her face in the fading light. "What happens to us now, Miss Celeste?" She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had chosen to stand with her, when he could have betrayed her, who had helped her see justice through to its terrible completion. "Now we wait for the authorities to come and settle the estate. We tell our story about the mysterious illness that claimed the family. We hope that whatever comes next is better than what came before." "And if it isn't?" Celeste smiled then, and, for the first time in years, it carried no bitterness or hidden agenda, just the weary acceptance of someone who had played their hand to its conclusion and was prepared to accept whatever consequences followed. "Then at least we'll face it knowing that justice was served, even if the price was higher than any of us wanted to pay." As darkness fell over the plantation, Celeste walked through the empty house one final time, her footsteps echoing in rooms that would never again hear the Whitmore family's voices. In the kitchen, she gathered her few possessions, a photograph of Lily, a worn Bible, the earrings her grandmother had given her, and placed them in a small cloth bundle. Tomorrow would bring investigators and estate lawyers, buyers, and auctioneers. The plantation would be dismantled and sold, its human property scattered to new owners, or perhaps, if the war everyone whispered about finally came to pass, set free to find their own destinies. But tonight belonged to the ghosts that now walk these halls. Not just the Whitmores, but all the enslaved souls who had died in these fields, all the children sold away from their families, all the lives ground down in service to cotton and wealth and the comfortable lies that let good Christian people sleep soundly while others suffered. Celeste stepped out into the Charleston night, leaving behind the only home she had known for 15 years. The road stretched ahead of her, dark and uncertain, but finally, for the first time in her adult life, leading toward something that belonged to her alone. She had tasted justice, bitter and sharp as ground glass, and found it both more and less satisfying than she had imagined. Behind her, the plantation house stood silent and empty, its windows dark as the graves that now held the Whitmore family. The wind stirred the Spanish moss hanging from the ancient oaks, creating shadows that danced like spirits across the moonlit ground. And somewhere in that rustling darkness, the ghosts of the past and the promises of an uncertain future met and mingled, creating something new. Not quite redemption, not quite damnation, but something altogether more complex and human. Justice had been served one spoonful at a time, and in the serving, everyone involved had been transformed into something they had never expected to become. The slave cook had become an angel of death, The privileged family had become victims, and the natural order that had seemed so permanent had revealed itself to be as fragile as spun glass, easily shattered by the determined hands of someone, with nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. The grinding hour was over. The feeding hour was complete, and dawn would bring whatever came next for those who survived the reckoning. Subscribe and comment below. Did Celeste's revenge satisfy justice, or did she become the monster she fought against? Share your thoughts on this haunting tale of retribution and the terrible price of both oppression and vengeance in antebellum Charleston.